everyone, this is RG Sabat. Welcome back to my channel. So today I'm going to talk to you about rear steer. So if you're decided, you built a buggy and you've decided to have rear steer, I wanted to discuss a little bit what's implicated in having rear steer on the buggy. The first thing that I wanted to talk about is rear axle. So obviously you have several choices for rear axle that you can make into a rear steer axle. You have to remember one thing, is that every time you're using a rear axle as a steer axle, you have to remember that it must be stronger than the front axle. So assume you choose to use a Dana 60 front axle for the rear, because now it's in the rear of the buggy and most of the time you're trying to climb up hills, there's going to be a lot of stress on the rear axle. So the rear axle must be stronger. I would say probably 1.5 times to twice as strong as the front axle, especially in a rear steer configuration. So you can get away with using a Dana 60 front axle. Obviously you're gonna have to retube it. Usually what they do is they cut off the tube on one side, and then they put another tube in, and then they can center the pod and use it as a rear steer axle. Most of the time it involves a lot of custom work, and it involves also custom knuckles and many different fab parts that are to make the rear axle really strong. One of the really nice advantage of Rockwell 2.5 ton axles is that they are very strong. The housing is very strong. Obviously, if you want to run big size tires like the 44-inch tire, for example, you need to upgrade the stock axle shafts on the Rockwell. So in all reality, the Rockwell is really the easiest axle to have a rear steer, and this is one of their biggest advantage. And this is what I have in my buggy. I have a Rockwell front steer axle that is put in the back. And the nice thing about the Rockwells is they have two different pinions on the front and the back, and the pod can be actually turned around either way, depending which side you want the pinion to come out of. So the other nice thing about the Rockwells is that the knuckles and the kingpins are very, very strong, so they're going to take a lot of abuse. And so that's what makes it a really good rear steer axle. Obviously there's many other possibilities. I mean, the possibilities are pretty much endless in terms of what you can use as a rear steer axle. Sometimes you can use a completely custom fabricated axle housing. Like for instance, you can buy like a 9-inch housing and then build knuckles for it, and then hubs, and then brakes, etc. But you have to remember something though. The more custom of an axle, the more different than the norm of an axle, the more time and money you're going to spend on this axle in order to make it suitable to your application. Obviously, you can also make a 14-bolt rear axle, and in this case, you could just take the 14-bolt axle itself, which are pretty cheap, and you could just cut off the ends of it, buy inner seals so the oil doesn't escape out, and then buy some inner C's, knuckles, and then bearings. Obviously, this is to me this would be number 2 choice in terms of ease and affordability after the Rockwells. And then you could choose any other axle that you want, pretty much. But there's a lot of other possibilities, and obviously you have to match whatever axle you have in the front of the buggy too. So now that I talked about the rear axle choice, I want to talk now about how to actually do the steering for the rear. Obviously, it's going to be hydraulic. You have no other choice here. In my mind, there are 3 possibilities that you can use for steering a rear axle. The first one, obviously, I just want to be clear that you understand that the steering wheel is always going to be for steering the front axle. And then you're going to have some sort of a joystick in the center console that you can activate the rear axle to steer one way or the other. So now that you know that. So the three possibilities. Back to the three possibilities. So the first one, it's using your existing orbital valve. So obviously, if you already have a steering valve, an orbital valve for the front, then that's not going to really work for you as an option. But if you're building a buggy from scratch, you can buy an orbital steering valve that is called a Power Beyond orbital valve. And what this valve has is an extra port which can be plumbed into a rear steer using a hydraulic joystick. And what it does is it gives priority, hydraulic pressure priority to the front axle as it's turning. But you can also, but if you're not turning the front, the Power Beyond can power the rear axle to turn one way or the other. So this is obviously, it's affordable. It's the least components, but the only problem with it is that you can't really steer both axles, front and rear, at the same time. The other possibility, and a lot of people do that in the rock bouncer racing, is they use a second hydraulic steering fluid pump. So they have two different pumps ran by the engine. Both of them, they run by the engine rotation. And one of the pumps goes to the front steering, and the other pump goes to another hydraulic joystick, which can control the rear axle. Obviously, you need to have another reservoir too. So this kind of adds a little bit of a components. My personal favorite, and the third option, and my personal favorite is using a hydraulic power pack. So a hydraulic power pack is like a winch motor that is connected to a hydraulic pump, okay, or a hydraulic unit. It creates pressure. So, but this now turns fairly slowly. It's not as fast as the engine rotation, but it still generates enough displacement to move the rear axle. So it's called hydraulic over electric because it uses power straight from the battery. So you don't even need to have the engine running to steer the rear axle. And so it takes power from the engine to turn the heavy duty winch motor, and that in turn turns the hydraulic pump. And then that creates flow, which goes to the steering cylinder, this one here, and then it activates. So you can turn. It will push. It will only turn this particular pump on the hydraulic electric over hydraulic system. Only turns one way. It doesn't reverse rotation. So as it turns one way, as when you actuate the electric switch in order to make it turn one way, it will move the fluid one side, and it will make the steering the tire turn one way. However, how do you turn it the other way? So what they have added to these electric hydraulic over electric steering units is something that they call a reversing valve. So what this valve does, it actually reverses the flow electrically. So that an actuating solenoid, it electrically reverses the flow. So now the fluid is going to go from the other side, and then it's going to steer one way or the other. So the nice thing about this system is, obviously, if you're ever stuck in the bush somewhere with a dead engine, you can still steer your buggy out. And actually, over the years, this have helped me, I would say, 2 or 3 times to get out of the woods without having the engine running. I had some issues with the engine, and 3 times actually, and I was able to, somebody towed me back to camp, and I was able to fix my engine. So that's why I really like those electric over hydraulic units. They're actually used everywhere. Obviously, you need to get a double acting power pack. You know, there's different names for them, but they use them for dump trailers, for example, for a lift gate. They use them for snow plows. So they are all over the place, and you can find a small enough one that is small enough for you to fit in the belly of the buggy. Like mine fits right beside my transfer case near the belly band. So these are the choices that you have. Obviously, there's no right answer for having the rear steer. There are many different possibilities and choices. It's whatever you want to do, whatever works best for you. You have any questions? You want to discuss this further? Make sure to comment, and I will try to respond to your comments as soon as I can. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.